Democrats can read Trump's mind.
Mr. Reagan.
Now, to many of us, it's almost unthinkable that 50% of the country would still vote Democrat. Democrat politicians are obviously con artists. They only care about black people, the LGBT plus community, and immigrants, not because they like them, not because they think they're wonderful or they're oppressed or any of that kind of crap. They don't really care about the environment. They only pretend to care about these folks because they care about their votes. But not only are they con artists in order to get votes, but as we've seen with Nancy Pelosi and her Wall Street schemes and Joe Biden and his bribery schemes, they're also con artists in terms of enriching themselves financially. And yet, despite their obvious corruption, they still get millions of votes. Millions and millions of Americans support these criminals. Why? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. Democrat voters have been convinced entirely that we Republicans are evil. Human beings naturally believe that there is a difference between doing something wrong and being evil. It's like the difference between getting into a car accident and intentionally running down pedestrians. One of these actions is regrettable. The other action is pure evil. But Democrats have taken this to an extreme. Democrats can interpret anything as either perfectly acceptable or totally evil based on just one criteria. Are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? If you're a Democrat and you decide to take your office to lunch at McDonald's, Democrat voters, they won't think anything about it. They'll just consider it a normal lunch at the office. But if, on the other hand, Donald Trump orders McDonald's for people, oh gosh, somehow that's pure evil. A Democrat can watch Joe Biden trip while he's walking upstairs, and they will interpret it as a simple mistake. They will watch Donald Trump walk carefully down a slippery ramp, and they'll interpret that as a sign of ill health. I mean, it gets said time and time again by Republicans such as myself that if Democrats didn't have double standards, they would have no standards at all. And that's absolutely true. But why? Well, it's because of this belief in the intrinsic evil of Republicans. Democrats have been convinced by their political leaders and by the media that Republicans like me are evil, racist, homophobe, misogynist, and that everything that we do, everything that we think, everything that we say, it's all motivated by this evil desire to control women, to subjugate black people, and to genocide the LGBTQ plus community. Look, Democrat voters are religious fanatics. They are cultists. They have all been conditioned to believe things that are not true about Republicans. It's the same sort of thing that happened in World War II. There is a particular group of people that got the blame for everything, every problem in German society, and that group was rounded up and executed. And this was for the benefit of one political party. And this is exactly what's happening today with Democrats. They have decided that it is of great benefit to them and great benefit to their political power to paint Republicans as pure evil. Now, the problem with this philosophical premise, the premise that one group is all motivated by evil and the other group is all motivated by good, is that you end up interpreting a person's actions by your assumptions about their motivations instead of making guesses about their motivations by examining those actions. Now, this is very bad because a person could do something that is perfectly normal or good or well-intentioned, and it would then be interpreted as pure evil. Whereas another person could do exactly the same thing, but maybe they actually did have completely evil and terrible intent. But because the assumption of this person is that, they are intrinsically good, it just becomes disregarded, or it's interpreted as some kind of a mistake, or at the very least, insignificant. But this is, of course, impossible, because to believe that a particular group is entirely motivated by evil, one has to have the gift of mind reading. And perhaps I'm wrong about this, but I don't believe that mind reading is something that actually exists. Maybe a little. Maybe I'm not disregarding the possibility of some level of telepathy. I don't know. But I highly doubt that Democrats are all blessed with the innate ability to read the minds of Republicans. And they're all completely convinced that Republicans are evil because they all know our innermost evil thoughts. And I'm actually totally convinced that this is not true because Democrats claim that Republicans are bigots. And I know for a fact that I myself, at least, I am not a bigot. So obviously they are wrong about that. And look, this is a completely irrational basis for a political philosophy. The idea that you can know the internal motivations and intentions of somebody, particularly the motivations and intentions that completely contradict what they've actually said their motivations and intentions are. This is a terrible basis for a political philosophy. In order to live by this philosophy, one must accept by faith alone, without any evidence, that the idea that a particular group of people is just entirely motivated by evil. And again, this is a cult. And you might think, well, yes, everything that you say is true, Chris, but does any of that really matter? Is it all that important that Democrats are irrational and gullible cultists? This is something that we all know. And yeah, you're right. It is something we all know. However, the reason I'm making a video about this is because it's particularly important with regard to the persecution of Donald Trump by Democrats. It's one thing for an irrational, delusional philosophy to infect a political party so much that that political party gains control of elections, even presidential elections. I mean, that's bad, but that's kind of the nature of political philosophies in general. They can become cult-like. They can trick people into granting power to corrupt politicians. And this has been true since time immemorial. What's the difference here? What the difference here is, and what's far more dangerous, is that this political philosophy, this philosophy of hate, has actually transcended into the persecution of a former president and the top presidential candidate for 2024. And look, if you think that basing criminal charges against Donald Trump on a perceived ability to read Donald Trump's mind is perfectly acceptable, well, then there's no need for you to watch this video. However, if you suspect that maybe this is not the best foundation for a criminal case, then keep watching because I'm about to explain this whole thing in one moment. First, of course, I have to sell you something. The US dollar has lost 85% of its value since the 1970s when the dollar decoupled from gold, and the government seems bent on continuing this tradition. From now until the next election, the government can print as much money as they want. The last time they did that, inflation went up 9%. This means one thing: the security of your future and your family's future, it's all in your hands. Make sure you freeze the value of the wealth that you are holding. Invest in gold with Noble Gold Investments. Gold is the one asset that is proven to withstand recession, inflation, and just about all economic threats. Noble Gold Investments is here to help you if you want to invest in gold. You will also get a 24-karat 1/4 ounce gold standard coin for free. Go to noblegoldinvestments.com right now, noblegoldinvestments.com, or simply call 1-877-646-5347, the only gold company that I trust. So here's the interesting thing about the accusation against Donald Trump. These accusations require the prosecution to be able to read Donald Trump's mind. This is something I've talked about since Donald Trump was first accused of inciting an insurrection on January 6th, 2021. Because look, the accusation is not that Donald Trump directly instructed the January 6th protesters to walk into the Capitol building. He did not instruct anybody to do anything like that. He didn't say cause damage. He didn't instruct them to hurt anyone. He didn't instruct them to kidnap anyone or to revolt, to bring in guns or anything like that. There was no direct open call for insurrection, as the Democrats want people to believe. What Trump stated in his speech on January 6th was that people should protest peacefully. But within that speech, there has been innocent statements that have been intentionally misinterpreted, so to indicate that Donald Trump, supposedly intended like these encoded messages that would inspire violence in the crowd, to incite an insurrection. But because Donald Trump didn't say anything that would directly inspire anything like what Democrats are claiming, the Democrats have relied on this political philosophy that Republicans are evil. And Donald Trump is, the most concentrated form of Republican evil that there is. Their proposition, and I'm not joking, this is the entire reason why Democrat voters believe Democrat politicians when they say that Donald Trump incited an insurrection, is that everything Donald Trump does is sinister, and therefore we have to break down everything he says and try to figure out what the sinister intent is in his statements. Is he saying that black people are inferior? Is he encouraging his supporters to viciously attack immigrants? Is he calling for the eradication of the gays? Is he insinuating that women are inferior? What is the hidden evil intent in Donald Trump's words? Well, in the January 6th speech, what the Democrat politicians told all of us that Trump was thinking was that he wanted his supporters to revolt against the American government, to violently take it over, and to erect Donald Trump as Emperor Supreme. This is, of course, absurd, but this is indeed what Democrat politicians want their Democrat voters to believe. And of course, they rely on the deeply held belief of Democrat voters that Trump and his followers are all intrinsically evil. This is why they can believe something so absurd as the idea that Trump incited an insurrection when he obviously did not. And until now, this has been a pretty annoying thing. Donald Trump was actually impeached over this idiotic idea. However, this was not actually a danger to American freedom. This is not a danger to the very fabric of our constitutional republic until that degenerate weasel, Jack Smith, actually filed charges against Donald Trump because of this illusion that Democrats can read the minds of evil Republicans. Now, before this philosophy was simply an absurd annoyance. But now Democrats are attempting to imprison a political opponent using the philosophy of magical mind reading that they have convinced their cultist voters is real. All right, guys, now maybe Trump didn't say what we're suggesting that he said, but he was thinking it. And we all know this because we know the truth, that deep down, Donald Trump is an evil man. But here's the real mind reading trick. In order for Democrats to sell the idea that Donald Trump's coded speech was effectively communicated to his supporters, and they knew that Donald Trump was telling them to violently riot or whatever Democrats are suggesting, Democrat politicians had to set up another story in the minds of Democrat voters. And that story is that ever since the November vote in 2020, Trump has always known for a fact that Joe Biden won the election fair and square, that there was no election fraud whatsoever. Anytime Donald Trump said that there was election fraud, they're trying to convince everyone that Donald Trump absolutely knew he was lying. He knew that that election was fair, and he's been lying about it since November of 2020. Donald Trump, he knew he was honestly and fairly defeated. He knew that. And he's just been pretending that he believed that the election was fraudulent in order to inspire his supporters to rise up and revolt one day and, like I said, install him as the Emperor Supreme. So this is the real mind-reading trick here, because there is no evidence whatsoever that Trump ever believed that the 2020 election was entirely fair or free of fraud. Joe Biden, remember, Joe Biden got 81 million votes, guys, the most votes of any presidential candidate in American history. And previous to the election, Joe Biden had almost zero enthusiasm among Democrats. I'm sure Democrats despise Donald Trump, and hate is a very powerful motivator. But it's a bit of a stretch to try and sell the idea that Joe Biden, a candidate that nobody cared about, got more votes than any president in the history of the country just because Democrats hated Donald Trump so much. Now, I actually have friends who do sincerely believe that, but I absolutely do not. I reject that outright. Before the election, I went out personally, like to interview people, to places like Portland, Oregon, right? And I interviewed Democrats, and I asked them, if it were inconvenient, would you go vote for Joe Biden? That is, if you had something better to do than vote, like you were on a vacation for a couple of weeks, something like that, would you go on that vacation, or do you stay home so you could get your vote in? And almost no one said that they would sacrifice anything in order to vote for Joe Biden. I asked the same question of Trump supporters, and every single Trump supporter said that they would crawl naked over broken glass to vote for Donald Trump. The enthusiasm gap was not simply some theoretical academic phenomenon that had no practical application. That was a real thing, and it was something that should have resulted in a landslide victory for Donald Trump. Instead, it resulted in a landslide victory for Joe Biden. That is precisely the opposite effect that such an enthusiasm gap should have resulted in. That alone is inexplicable. That alone indicates that something fishy went on in 2020. Not to mention the gazillion other things, the magical voting curve of Joe Biden. So look, I personally do believe that there was sufficient election fraud in 2020. And if I believe it, and I consider myself a relatively intelligent person, then it's not unreasonable that Donald Trump himself also believed it and still believes it. However, because Democrats have convinced their voters that Donald Trump's thoughts are always sinister and evil, it doesn't matter if it's reasonable to believe in election fraud or not. That doesn't matter. All that matters is that Donald Trump's thoughts are always evil, period. Therefore, if there's a question as to whether or not Donald Trump believed the election was fraudulent or not, and Democrats tell their voters, no, Trump knew 100% that the election was fair and perfect, and he's just lying to his supporters because evil Donald Trump wanted his supporters to revolt violently and take over the government and install himself as Emperor Supreme, well, then those Democrat voters, they will believe that because they are in a cult. Now, if you're not sure if the word cult is appropriate here, let me remind you that Democrats were polled after the 2020 election, and they were asked whether or not they believed that there was a possibility that the election was fraudulent. 30% of Democrats specifically responded that they thought that there was indeed a chance the election was fraudulent. Not just a chance, they thought it was likely. 30% of Democrat voters. If in some third world African republic there was an election in which 30% of the members of the winning party believed that their own election was fraudulent, everyone in America would know instantly that the government of that country is corrupt. We would not think twice about it. We would say, yep, they're corrupt. But for some reason in America, if 30% of Democrat voters suspect that their own party is corrupt, that's fine. Nobody cares. And I think that this exposes what goes on in the minds of Democrat voters. They're actually okay with corruption. As long as they think that the corrupt person is good deep down. I mean, if you care about the gays, if you care about the transgenders, if you care about the drag queens, if you care about the poor downtrodden blacks and the illegal immigrants and climate change and radical feminists, and all the people that I care about, I mean, if you care about all those people, then, corruption for financial gain or anything like that, all that's fine. I don't care about that. Steal taxes, take bribes from Ukraine, engage in insider trading. I don't care about any of that stuff. Just make sure you pass the laws that I want you to pass that'll benefit the lesbians. And of course, worst of all, they don't mind if Democrat politicians go ahead and steal elections. It doesn't matter to these people. They just want to know that you're not an evil bigot like Donald Trump. If it means keeping Republicans out of power, they do not care how corrupt Democrats are. Democrats can do whatever they want. They can stay in power. They can compromise American interests for foreign interests. They can enrich their families. None of that matters. Just keep Donald Trump out of office. That is what this cult thinks. They have no principles. They just have their philosophy of hate. And the crazy thing is that this is how Democrat politicians always go after Donald Trump. Every accusation, every single accusation that Democrats have leveled against Donald Trump has relied on telepathy, mind reading. And what's great about that for Democrats is that you never have to prove what's in somebody's mind. You can just convince everybody that nothing of what this guy says is true, and that, this guy's always got some underlying evil motivation, intention, agenda. I mean, and if they can convince their voters of this, well, they can make up anything they want. They could tell people, hey, this is what this guy's actually thinking. And Democrat voters are likely to believe them. Look, if you can manage to pull off this kind of a con, it's a fantastic con. You have massive manipulative power over people's minds. And again, this is why I say that Democrats are all in a cult. And when I say that every accusation relies on mind reading, I really mean that every time. Democrats accused Donald Trump of colluding with Russians. Remember that? The evidence they presented was always completely divorced from anything that Donald Trump was actually doing. However, the reason they were able to convince their voters that Donald Trump was somehow conspiring with the Russians is that they were able to convince people that Donald Trump just appreciated any attempt to sway the election by the Russians. He just didn't hate it, right? Their position was essentially whatever the Russians did to sway the election, which in reality was almost nothing, but whatever they did to sway the election, if Trump just didn't hate it, well, then that was an indication that Trump was in fact in on it. That was enough. Democrat politicians just needed to point to Donald Trump and say, because he's not condemned any attempt by the Russians to sway the election in his favor, well, that means that Donald Trump is complicit in helping them to do it. They made this absurd jump from Trump not hating something to Trump sitting in a dark room with a map like Hitler in World War II, conspiring with Putin. A clearer example of this is when Donald Trump made that phone call to Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine. Donald Trump was impeached for this phone call. Now, Donald Trump did not, as Democrats insist, threaten or even pressure Vladimir Zelensky in any way whatsoever. And Zelensky actually said that Trump did not pressure him in any way. And if you read the transcript, Donald Trump obviously believed that Joe Biden was guilty of crimes in Ukraine, something that we now know is absolutely true. And he was asking Zelensky for help in collecting evidence to expose this corruption. Now, when they decided to impeach him, Democrats presented this absurd case that Donald Trump knew for a fact that Joe Biden was perfectly innocent of any kind of corruption, and that what Donald Trump was doing was not asking Zelensky to dig up real evidence of corruption, but rather to manufacture evidence in order to create the illusion of corruption to help him in the 2020 election. This is exactly what they did with the January 6th accusation. Well, this isn't necessarily what Trump said, but this is what Trump meant. Sure, you might read the transcript and think that what Trump said was perfectly innocent, but this is what he really meant. And you can believe us because we're the honest Democrats, and you can't believe Donald Trump because he's the evil Republican. And bizarrely, this actually works. Again, because Democrats have no principles. They simply have their philosophy of hate, their idiotic cult. What's particularly frustrating is that Democrats have now conflated the concept of beyond a reasonable doubt, this idea that's needed to convict somebody of a crime, with the suspicious activity that might be needed simply to open an investigation into somebody. For Joe Biden, they've distorted it one way, and for Donald Trump, they've distorted it in precisely the opposite way. What I mean by that is Democrats, especially in the media, they take anything that Donald Trump does or says, and they break down every word, every letter, every syllable, and they read into it, and they claim they see dog whistles and all this kind of stuff. And so then they can make an actual criminal case out of something that they interpreted that there's no actual evidence for. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is actually guilty of crimes, like massively guilty, tons of evidence, a giant pile of evidence. And the Democrats say, there's no smoking gun here. Like, what are you talking about? We're just trying to open an investigation. They're like, oh, there's not enough evidence here to open an investigation because there's no smoking gun. We don't have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in order to convict Joe Biden right now. Therefore, we can't open an investigation. It's like, do you understand the difference between convicting somebody in a court of law for a crime and opening an investigation? Like, Democrats have it completely backwards with Joe Biden, and then they just have it completely backwards with Trump, but in the opposite way. It's like insanity with these people. It's like when Donald Trump took classified documents out of the White House and they put them in Mar-a-Lago, right? The problem wasn't that he took the documents and he stored them in Mar-a-Lago. None of that was actually the real issue, right? Because if that was the issue, right, then Joe Biden would be in trouble. No, the problem with Donald Trump doing that is it's that Donald Trump is a bad person. And, according to several Democrats, Donald Trump's intention with these classified documents or whatever the documents were he took out of the White House, he was intending to sell them to the Russians. Donald Trump, a billionaire, they say was going to sell American secrets to the Russians. For what? The guy was president of the United States. He's got this amazing legacy. He's going to throw it all away for what, like a couple $1,000s? It doesn't make any sense. But according to Democrats, that was his secret motivation. That's why he had those documents. And how do they know this? Because obviously Donald Trump is pure evil. He doesn't need a rational explanation. He just needs the motivation of the pure evil within him. He'll just do any crazy thing, stuff that doesn't even make sense because he's so evil. Well, look, I hope this gives you guys some kind of an insight into the way I think the Democrat voter thinks. The reason I like to make these videos to talk about how Democrat voters think, talk about how Democrat politicians think, because I think it's important that when we're having these discussions with, in our everyday lives, might be with our mother-in-law, might be with coworkers, might be with a good friend with whom you rarely speak about politics. But when we find ourselves confronted with abject irrationality and just totally absurd ideas, I think it is critical to understand why it is that a Democrat might say the things that he says, or why he might believe the things that he believes. And I think that this kind of an insight will allow us to both have maybe a little bit of sympathy for that person because they've obviously been brainwashed, but also perhaps it'll give us a little bit of an edge in our attempt to reach that person on an intellectual level, on an emotional level, and just to connect with them and to be able to perhaps convince them that maybe not all Republicans are actually as evil as they think. And maybe, just maybe, the next time that you sit down with your Democrat mother-in-law and you two are screaming at each other about politics, maybe she'll recognize that Rachel Maddow is actually lying to her. It's not likely, but I am a hopeless optimist. Well, that's it for me. And remember, it's not that liberal friends are ignorant. It's just they know so much that is not so. Good night.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election.